right, if you'd open up your Bibles tonight to the book of 2 Corinthians. 2 Corinthians, chapter 11. And we're going to start in verse number 16. 2 Corinthians, chapter 11, starting in verse number 16 is where we're going to be tonight. Read of a story while I was getting ready for this. There was a pastor that told this story that there was as a young child, he sat terrified in a church pew, and it was time for the dreaded business meeting. However often they were having that, it was time, and the men of the church in particular were basically shouting back and forth at each other over the particular issue of the day. And one man stood out from the rest, though, of the congregation of almost 1,000 that were in the room that morning. He was an older man, had long white flowing beard, and he said he kind of looked like Santa Claus, and he didn't know why Santa Claus was so mad at church. And he'd always been a kind man to him, but on this particular morning, he wasn't being so kind. And so this young boy's attention was kind of riveted as the man was pointing his finger directly at the pastor that was standing in front. And he stood there and he began shouting things about the issue of the day that they were discussing. They weren't really discussing, they were yelling and arguing. And this older gentleman in the church was confronting the pastor with that pointed finger out and said, "Who died and made you boss? Who died and made you boss?" And he said he was taken back by that. Because he said, "I was so confused." He said, "I thought, he's not our boss, but he was the pastor of our church." And he didn't really know what to make of the situation that was unfolding in front of his young self. And he was very confused. But essentially what was happening on that morning in the business meeting at the church was there was a power struggle going on in the life of that church. It was a struggle between a lot of different groups that were in the church. It wasn't just between this man and the pastor. It wasn't just between this group and that group. There was a real issue that was happening there, and it was going on. Paul, in the book of 2 Corinthians, and really in the 1 Corinthians as well, he's dealing with a similar issue of a power struggle. Paul had gone to Corinth. He'd been instrumental in working with the Corinthian believers and the church that had started there. But in his absence, opponents had resisted the authority that was delegated by Paul to be a leader and leaders in the congregation. And there was a power struggle going on. And Paul was not there directly and in person to address it. And so he writes letters to the church to tell them how to deal with the issues that were going on. This is not a problem that went away when the New Testament was finished being written. This is a problem that is still being dealt with in churches today. But Paul is writing to the church at Corinth and telling them, you've got some real issues here, and you need to deal with some of these things. Paul's longest letter was the book of Romans, but if you were to take the book of 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians and put them together, they would come out to be longer than the book of Romans. The book of 1 Corinthians particularly deals with some of the really bad theological and behavioral things that they were dealing with. And 2 Corinthians is particularly dealing with the institution, if you will, of the church there in Corinth, some of the resistance of authority, some of the things that they weren't doing. They weren't necessarily wrong, but they were not the things that Paul had taught them about and the things that they were supposed to be doing. The book of Romans is deeply theological. Paul never traveled to Rome, and he needed to lay out some of those things to them and teach them some of those things. That's why the book of Romans has so much in-depth theology in it. But the book of 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians is much more situational to the church at Corinth than to the church at Rome. And so he had personal experience there, and he was talking about those things. And Paul had been there, but after he left, some of the Corinthian believers had kind of fallen back into some old habits and some old traditions. And Paul is addressing some of those old traditions that they were hanging on to at this point in the book of 2 Corinthians. And he was addressing those practices that he had said, this is not exactly how you're supposed to be doing it in a New Testament church. They were kind of falling back on some of the old things that they had done. And I love what Paul does here in this passage that we're going to read tonight. What I love about Paul is he's very forceful and he's very real. As you read and as you listen to the text tonight here in just a second, I want you to kind of listen for how he would have said it to them, or how he would, if he had been there in person, or how it would have been read, most likely out loud, to the other believers there gathered. He's extremely sarcastic. I like that. I appreciate that. I appreciate the sarcasm that Paul throws in there. We all learn in different ways. Some of us learn experientially. Some of us learn by putting our hands on things and figuring it out. But all of us have to learn some things by listening and paying attention. And Paul is doing that teaching in that way. But there are a lot of different ways that people can teach us. And there are a lot of different methods that people can invoke in order that we pay attention more. And Paul is doing one of those things right here. He's grabbing their attention by pointing out the insanity of some of the things that they're doing. And he does it in an amazing, sarcastic way here. And he'll tell us in the text tonight, hey, don't forget, this is me just kind of being sarcastic here. And so he's making that very clear to us tonight. And this is where we find ourselves. So look at 2 Corinthians chapter 11. I'm going to read all the way down through verse 30. So track along with me. 2 Corinthians chapter 11, starting in verse 16. I repeat, let no one think me foolish, but even if you do, accept me as a fool, so that I may boast a little. What I am saying with this boastful confidence, I say not as the Lord, but as a fool. Since many boast according to the flesh, I too will boast. You hear just the touch of sarcasm here from Paul. For you gladly bear with fools, being wise yourselves. For you bear it if someone makes slaves of you, or devours you, or takes advantage of you, or puts on airs, or strikes you in the face. To my shame, I must say, we were too weak for that. But whatever anyone else dares to boast of, I am speaking of a fool. That's how we know he's being sarcastic here. I also dare to boast of that. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they offspring of Abraham? So am I. Are they servants of Christ? I'm a better one. I love that. I am talking like a madman. Here's how we know that he's being sarcastic and just wanting to get his point across. I'm talking like a madman, with far greater labors, far more imprisonments, with countless beatings, and often near death. 5 times I received at the hands of the Jews the 40 lashes less one. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. And a night and day I was adrift at sea, on frequent journeys, in danger from rivers, danger from robbers, danger from my own people, danger from Gentiles, danger in the city, danger in the wilderness, danger at sea, danger from false brothers, in toil and hardship through many a sleepless night, in hunger and thirst, often without food, in cold and exposure. And apart from these other things, there is the daily pressure of my anxiety for all the churches. Who is weak, and I am not weak? Who is made to fall, and I am not indignant? If I must boast, I will boast of the things that show my weakness. I think about halfway through that list that Paul gives, the people that were listening to that were like, Paul, okay, we get it. Just stop. But he keeps going. He just keeps going, on and on and on. How many, and go back and look in your Bible, how many things do you see in verses 23 through 27 that we would say are sufferings? It's going to take you a second. How many sufferings do you count in verses 23 through 27? I'll give you just a minute. I don't have a prize for the winner, but I will tell you a good job. you get there, throw out a best guess.
Some of me generalizes in too, so you don't have any.
It's a little bit of a trick question. It is.
17.
17, okay, very close. Very close. And my translation may be slightly different from the list I'm looking at here, and your translation as well. Anybody else want to venture a guess? 17 is really close. I will tell you that much. At least by what I counted.
I counted 23.
23, okay. All right. 21, okay. Anybody else want to venture a guess? None of you are exactly right, at least by my count. Anybody else? Last chance. Going once, going twice. All right, we got a winner back there. 20 is what I count. 20. All right. Worked harder, prison more frequently, flogged more severely, exposed to death many times, 39 lashes, 5 times, beaten with rods, shipwrecked 3 times, day and night in open sea, constantly moving, which was the tricky one to find, I think, endangered by rivers, endangered by bandits, endangered by fellow Jews, endangered by Gentiles, endangered in cities, endangered in the countryside, endangered at sea, endangered by false brothers, enduring sleepless nights, enduring hunger and thirst. That's one you could have counted twice there for sure. Enduring cold and nakedness. That's another one you could have counted twice there. But by my count, we get 20. If you count those last 2, you get 22. And so somewhere in there is about what we have. So let me ask you a question as we jump in tonight. How big are our problems? We're dealing with a real issue in our country and our world right now that seems like one of the worst things that's ever occurred. And I don't want to downgrade it. It is. It's a huge issue. People have lost their lives in this outbreak of virus, and people have lost their jobs as a result of some of the things that have been going on in our country and around the world. I don't want to downgrade that. But when we look at it in light of what Paul as an individual believer dealt with, it was a lot. He had a lot going on. He had a lot going on. And he didn't even live that long. Right? He had all this happen in the span of not too many years, to be honest. Right? This was not a huge span of time of 50, 60 years that all these things were occurring to him. It was occurring in a much shorter period of time there. And so the question is, do we really have it so bad? It sure seems like it sometimes, doesn't it? Where everything is falling apart in our lives, everything, the world is falling apart around us. We got things that are constantly going on. But when we think about it, it may not be as bad as we really think it is. And certainly it pales in comparison to what Paul dealt with and the list that he gives. I'm made aware of a lot of problems. And this doesn't, not just limited to things that go wrong here at church. I'm made aware of a lot of things that are going on all the time. And about 95% of them are related to personal comfort or personal benefit in one way or the other. Now, I like the next guy. I'm glad that the air conditioning is working in this room tonight. Don't get me wrong. I'm glad we have air. I'm glad these pews are padded. I like coffee, and I like good coffee. I probably like that more than most. And so, things that we like, there's nothing wrong with liking things and being able to come to a facility like this that is comfortable. This room's fairly temperate. We can sit in here and be fairly comfortable. I like it as much as the next guy. But when those things become more important than the reason we're here, it's when we have a real problem. It's when we have a problem. Paul is laying that out there and saying, guys, if you want to list all the things that you're dealing with, let me give you my own list. And let me explain what's going on. Think back over the passage. Our problems are not that great. The problem that Paul is addressing here is the boasting of his quote-unquote opponents. The boasting. That's the attitude. When I was growing up, one of the things that I was always told to not do was, and I'm sure I did this, if I had called my mother, she would tell you, example after example, I'm sure. She always said, don't stoop down to someone else's level in terms of if they insult you, don't think you have to go one step lower or one step bigger in boasting an insult. You know, it's pretty good advice. But the funny thing about this text is, this is exactly what Paul does, right? He said, you guys are the biggest boasters about all this stuff. I'll show you how to boast. Let me really show you how to do this right. And then you got to be quiet while I list all these things. And what he's doing here is he's illustrating the insanity of what they're talking about and won't quit boasting about. He reaches the point about halfway through that list, and the guys are probably thinking, Paul, stop. And he's like, I'm just getting started, guys. You want to hear some boasting? I'll show some boasting. I'll tell you what's really going on. Paul's kind of saying here, you guys are fools for boasting and all these things. And so for just a minute, just a few minutes here, I'm going to stoop down to your level, and I'm going to show you who really should be able to boast. And don't forget, I'm a fool as I do this, which is this little underhanded way of saying, so are you, right? When you do this, you look foolish. And that's what Paul's saying there. My pastor growing up, he told a story probably more than once. And he told a story of a person that did not believe in Jesus, and he came to the pastor and said, I have a lot of questions. I want to ask you some questions about some of these things that I just can't quite understand. And they came and they met together, and the gentleman asked this question. He said, and maybe you've heard this, he said, could God make a rock so big that even God couldn't pick it up? And as he's telling the story, the pastor responded, could God make a man so dumb that he would ask a question? And we say that in a lighthearted way, looking back upon the story. But what really that man is saying is what I think is more important. I'm going to boast in my knowledge and boast in my arrogance and try to outsmart not the pastor in that situation, but I'm trying to outsmart God in that situation. That's kind of what Paul's doing here, right? He's getting down to their petty level at which the Corinthians are in these actions, and they're appearing to take them at his word until you ever been in a conversation where about halfway through the conversation you realize they're talking about you? You ever been there? They're like, oh, that hurts just a little bit right there. Right? I didn't know you were talking about me. You know, that's kind of what Paul's doing here. He's kind of coming to the point in talking to these Corinthians. And I think they probably realized, not immediately, this is how foolish some of these things really are. Look back at verse 22 with me tonight. Chapter 11, verse 22. Paul says, are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they offspring of Abraham? So am I. Isn't it incredible how much stock some people put into their pedigree and who they know and who they are and who their daddy was and who their granddaddy was and who all these other people are? One pastor said he's never been quite able to understand why some people seem to feel as if they're better than others because their ancestors happened to come over on the Mayflower. What does that have to do with them now? It doesn't have a lot to do. There's all kinds of organizations devoted to ancestry, and to be in the group, you have to be able to prove your association with that. I made a huge mistake this afternoon. I decided to look up some of the what are called lineage organizations and see if I could find some interesting ones. Oh boy, did I find some interesting ones, and I'll share a few of them with you tonight. But just to kind of give you an idea of what we're talking about, organizations like the Daughters of the American Revolution, the Alamo Defenders Descendants Organization. I didn't know that was a thing, but it is. Sons of the Confederate Veterans, Sons of the Union Veterans, all these different ones. But then I found some pretty interesting ones, and I thought I'd share them with you tonight. I can't believe these are actual organizations, but I went, not just to the list where it listed them, but I went to their websites and figured out how to join. I'm not eligible for any of these that I know. The Associated Daughters of Early American Witches, first founded in 1985. The descendants of illegitimate sons and daughters of the kings of Britain. Okay? The descendants of whaling masters of Maine. You have to be able to prove your heritage there. And this is my favorite one. The National Society of Saints and Sinners. This organization was founded in Washington, D.C. They meet every 2 years. And so I looked up their website. I'm like, hey, This sounds like a fun organization. Let me look up some information about the National Society of Saints and Sinners. Fun fact, they only list the approved saints of the Catholic Church as being the ones that you're eligible to prove your heritage and lineage and join that particular organization. They don't list any sinners on there. I don't know why they don't list that out, because shouldn't we all be eligible to join the National Society of Saints and Sinners based on our standing before God? If we're in Christ, we're a saint, but we're still a saint, we should all be able to join that group. And I love history, and I'm sure I'm eligible to join some of the 5 printout pages of organizations that I found today while looking this up. But let me ask you one question, and I'll ask myself this question about those as well. If I joined one of those organizations that I was eligible for, and I know there are several that I am eligible for, if I joined one, if you joined one, based on your heritage, based on an ancestral going back to one of those groups, does it make me or you a better person than someone who is not in the group? What do you think? It doesn't make us any better, does it? It sets us apart. It says my father, my grandfather fought in World War II, or was in the Civil War, or the American Revolution, or any of these things, or they were a witch in Salem, Massachusetts in the 1600s. I hope not, but there's an organization for it. It doesn't make us any better. That's the attitude that Paul is pushing back upon in this text. He recognizes the foolishness of someone depending on something that's already happened and is in the past that doesn't matter anymore. You are not saved because your parents went to church. You're saved because you have a relationship with Jesus Christ. If your parents go to church and bring you to church, the likelihood of you encountering Jesus and accepting Christ is much higher. But it doesn't guarantee it. You're not a Christian because you were born into a Christian family. You're a Christian heritage, but you're not a believer, a born-again believer in Jesus Christ until the moment that you accept salvation offered by Jesus Christ. Paul's point here is that these things don't have any real importance. Doesn't mean they're bad, they're just not that important. Christians today still like to brag about pedigree, don't they? My granddaddy was a founding member of this church. My dad's a deacon. I heard that from a student one time as the reason they were in the gym at 3 in the morning. That's not going to fly with them. That is a true story. I'm not going to tell you who it was. Christian leaders do it too. The more numbers and letters after their name or before their name, they think they're better. The size of their church affects how they feel about themselves. I graduated from Lander University. And when I tell people about it, I tell them it is the finest university in all of Greenwood, South Carolina. It just so happens to be the only university in all of Greenwood, South Carolina. But it's the best. When we put stock and weight into things that don't have ultimate prominence, or at least they shouldn't, then we began to fight this battle back and forth between what is the thing of God and what is not a thing of God. A friend and a leader, he was a friend of mine, I haven't seen him in years. His name is Dwight Huffman. Dwight, during our time Rebecca and I's time in Canada, we knew him before that. If you ever met him or he was introducing himself to someone in a conference or a church or something like that, he would introduce himself exactly like this. And I will remember it for a long time. He said, "Hey, my name is Dwight and I do a little bit of church planting." That's how he introduced himself every time to someone that he did not know. What he didn't tell anybody like that, he was actually the national director of church planting for all of Canada. But he never said that. He just said, "My name's Dwight and I'm doing some church planting." And so he'd get up on stage and talk about all the things that were going on nationally in Canada for church planting, and people were like, "Whoa, I didn't know that's who that was. I wonder what I said." And he had this attitude about himself that what I'm doing is more important than who I am. Starting churches, pastoring churches, training and raising up leaders is much more important than who I am and the title that's behind my name. And he modeled that. What Paul is doing here is he's pointing out the craziness of the argument by turning it back upon the believers there in Corinth. He says, you say this matters. Well, if it does, I'm better at you at all those things. He says, if this matters, I'm better than you. And that's kind of his sarcasm there. So let's go back to our original question. How big are our problems? What are our problems? You see, our problems don't seem so big, and our issues don't seem to be so big when we compare them to the things Paul was enduring and the things that other people have to deal with in their lives. Most of us in this room tonight, most of us that are a part of this church, we have a lot of things that we don't even realize that we have sometimes. Most of us, I believe every one of us here tonight has a home that we go home to. And most of us won't go home tonight to be hungry. Most of us have a lot of things that a lot of people in the rest of the world, they don't have. And for the huge majority of us, we don't have to worry about things that a lot of people do. And that's a blessing. After Paul lists all those things, he gets down to verse 28, and he lists one more. He says, there is great pressure on me of my anxiety for all the churches. He wants to turn the topic off of the challenges to his body, the shipwrecks, the hunger, all those things. And he says, these are the challenges that I'm dealing with. But here's another one. I worry about you guys. I worry about how you're doing in your church in Corinth, in Philippi, in Galatia, and all these places that he'd been. He worries about those places. And he even calls it, some translations use the word anxiety, the ongoing worry and concern about what's going on. Paul was so passionate about the churches that he had been a part of, helping start, helping lead, encouraging, that it was causing him this type of worry and concern. And he wanted them to share the gospel. He wanted the message of Christ to go out. That's why he went to these places to begin with, right? That's why he took the missionary journeys. He wanted the message of Christ to go all over. And that's what he wanted. So the question that we're left with tonight, in response to Paul's list of things that he dealt with, and the idea that there are some things that are huge and some things that are not so huge, is what are we to do now? What are we to do now? We're living in a really interesting time right now in May of 2020. Most of us have never experienced a time like this where there's this global pandemic and people are figuring out things on the fly, really. Schools were closed down, restaurants. I mean, it's just a weird time that we're still really living through a lot of these things. And no matter what we think or feel about how the response was from government officials or churches or businesses or any of that stuff, the point is we're living in strange times. And I think God may be trying to use this time to get people to ask questions that we've been trying to get them as the church to answer for years. Especially in the first few weeks, people were asking questions like, what happens if I die? What does eternity hold? Is there a heaven? Is there a hell? Is there a God? How can I not be afraid of those things that I see and I hear all the time? And whether it's a huge threat, it's a small threat, it depended on several factors, how old you were, your risk factors, where you lived, all those different things. Everybody was asking the same question. And the interesting thing about that is, it's the question that we've been trying to get people to ask for years as the church. And God has given us an opportunity here. We're living in a strange time in our world. But we're also living in a strange time in the life of our church, where things are different. Things are different. My pastor that I had growing up is, I believe he's 80-something now. He's pastoring a very small church of about 30 or 40 people. The church I grew up in was much larger, and he retired from that. And he's been pastoring this church for 10 or 12 years. Small church, and is loving it. He's been posting online sermons. He said, the first week, he said, this is the first time I've ever had a sermon filmed since 1956 in preaching class. He said, never had that happen to me before. But he went out and found a way to get a message out to the church about what was going on. We're living in strange times. When we gather back together for Sunday school, and Bible studies, and small groups in just a few weeks, things are going to be a little bit different. When people begin to come back to worship, things are going to be a little bit different. We don't know all the things that are going to be different. We're living in the midst of it right now. We don't know what the other side is going to be when we come back out of this. We don't know if we're going to have to wear a mask on a plane forever. I sure hope not. I don't want to fly anywhere if I have to wear a mask on a plane. That's just me. I don't want to do some of those things. But we don't know. We don't know what we're going to be living in at that point. But here's the thing that we need to remember. Whenever something like this happens, we have to realize two things. Number one, God is in control of it all. And number two, He may be trying to get our attention. He may be trying to get our attention. And so the only way that God can get our attention sometimes is to go so drastic that we can't not pay attention to what He wants to do. We don't know exactly what He's trying to accomplish through all this right now, but we know He has the plan. We know He knows what the other side of this is going to look like. And it doesn't matter what any government official decides. It doesn't matter what everybody else thinks. It doesn't matter where we fit in to all of those things, although God has a plan for each and every one of our lives. God knows the plan. He already knows what's going to look like on the other side. But what is our purpose in that plan? How are we going to respond to what God is trying to get us to understand? How are we, personally as believers, going to come out on the other side of this trial that we're living in the midst of right now? Are we going to come back to normal? Or are we going to come back with a renewed focus upon the message of Christ? There's really only two things to do. Are we going to come back just like it's always been in our personal lives and in the life of our church? Or are we going to come back with a renewed focus upon proclaiming the gospel here in this building, here in this city? Are we going to come back with a renewed focus to cry out to Him, to pray that God would do something in our lives and in the life of our church, that God would draw people to Himself? What are we going to do in response to what God is trying to do in the midst of this world? We don't know the answers to all these questions that are before us. But what I do know is God already has the whole thing figured out. He's already got it all figured out. Are we going to be a part of it? Are we going to strive to reach out? Are we going to do these things that God is wanting us to do? Are we even going to pay attention? Are we going to go back to the distractions of before? Before this whole thing, many parents were so distracted with the things that were going on in the lives of their children, from sporting events to academic competitions. Many families hadn't sat down for a meal together in years because they're so busy. Many in our church, in our churches, were gone so much that worship and small group Bible study were here if we needed it, but it wasn't going to take the place of the lake. And it wasn't going to take the place of the things that we wanted to do. It wasn't going to affect any of those things. Maybe God's trying to get our attention that the things of Him are the most important. And it's going to look different for all of us on the other side of this. But are we going to go back to normal? Are we going to live out a new renewed focus upon the proclamation of the gospel in everywhere that we go? I pray that we'll do that as a church. And it's going to start with us. It's going to start with each individual in this body of believers saying, God, this is what I know you want me to do. With your help, with your word, and with a connection to you, that's what I'm going to do. Let's pray together tonight. God, thank you so much for the opportunity to gather here in your name. We love you. We're thankful for you. But God, we're living in a lost and dying world. God, we don't know exactly what the future holds, but we know you've got it. We have questions. We have concerns. We have anxiety, just like Paul did, about what it's going to look like in the future. How's our church going to weather this storm? How are people going to respond? What are God's people going to do? God, may we always have a renewed focus to go back to the core message of the gospel. As we share it, as we proclaim it, in each and every way that we do that, God, may we always go back to that. God, we love you and thank you. Ask for blessings upon these that have gathered here tonight and those that will watch later. Thank you for everything, Jesus. It's in your name that I pray tonight. Amen.